Welcome to the Zachrilege Cast podcast, YouTube video interview program that features Zach Law, that's me, talking to some of the best and brightest in the atheist / secular / awesome community. This is episode number 114, and I am recording live on October 5th, 2017. And this week I actually clicked off the YouTube thing so I won't get an echo. Yay! Thanks to Fred Sims of O'Reilly Radio for being on and apparently jinxing the Tennessee Titans last week. Check him out. He's a peach. Tonight's guest is a return guest. When I heard about the Mythicist Milwaukee conference and the huge right turn they experienced, I knew I needed boots on the ground. Karen Garst is the faithless feminist, and we've had her on the show before. And when we had the debate happened, what it's called, the debate discussion between Thomas Smith and Carl, well, we knew who would be first to ask a question. Welcome back to the show, Karen.
Thank you very much. I had to maneuver myself carefully for that one. Yep.
That crowd, it must have been standing up from the start. But now, of course, this isn't your first conference. About how many atheist conferences you've been to? What was the first one?
Well, when my husband and I left religion, we didn't join any atheist groups. So until I started writing, I hadn't been to anything. But I went to the Women in Secularism conference, and I went to the Reason Rally, and I went to this. So that's all I've done just, in the past couple of years.
Women in Secularism. So is that a good one?
It was very interesting. I met a number of women. Some of them became the authors in my new book. And so it introduced me to a lot of different people. It was kind of small, but it was very interesting.
Excellent. And by the way, tonight I'm drinking a special beer. This is called the Cosmic and the Divine. This is a stout with caramel pecans, chocolate, and sea salt from Burial in North Carolina, and JWB, which is a brewery I'm not familiar with. I'm not sure where they're from, but anyway. Sometimes religious-themed beverages in this show, sometimes not. So when did you decide that you wanted to go to this year's Mythicist Milwaukee conference? Because this is, I believe, the third year they've done it. They may have done it longer.
Well, I had been on their podcast about my first book, Women Beyond Belief. And then I also did a Skype presentation of the slideshow I have, which is From Goddess to God, Elimination of the Feminine Divine, for one of their meetup groups. And I met them at Reason Rally. And one of them said that their mom would like my book. So, we kind of bonded. So I knew them, and they reached out to me last spring and asked me to do some advertising about the conference on my blog. And I did that, and they gave me some tickets to give away. And then they gave me 2 free VIP tickets. So I went to grad school in Madison, have a really good friend who's in Oshkosh, said, you want to join me? And I've got these 2 tickets. So I made that decision more in my relationship with them than really looking at the content of the conference. I think a lot of people do that, like, oh, I'd like to go to MythCon, but you don't look at it real carefully. I think one of the things I noticed was the movie Batman versus Jesus, and that looked really interesting.
Yeah, they've been talking about that for a long time. I think last year's conference, because last year's Mythicist conference featured the Robert Price, Bart Ehrman debate, and that was really the key. And I think they either released a trailer to the movie last year or they did it at the Reason Rally, because I don't know if a lot of people know, they were like the sound people, and I think they did the recording for the Reason Rally. So they're pretty well known in the community. And you made a point that, because I listened to a ton of recap type shows, like I listened to Matt Dillahunty's today, and he talked about how he does a lot of conferences. So when he gets invited to one, he doesn't look into who's coming. He's just like, all right, book me for Milwaukee and let me show up. So that was definitely a pull for you, because that was close to kind of where you grew up and you were familiar with the hosts.
Well, yes. And I had agreed to support the conference. And I do remember that debate between Price and Ehrman, and I've read both of them, and that would have been really interesting to see. That was kind of the thing I was looking for, was kind of an intellectual discussion about atheism and what are the different points of view. And I think maybe that was my expectation. But you can see I haven't been to a lot of these, so didn't really know. But yeah, that's where I lived 7 years in Madison, and so it was good to go back.
Well, did you, as the conference kind of approached, did you see, because there's a little bit of a swell, and it might have just been atheist and maybe just the circles I'm in, there's a lot of discussion as it was approaching, and definitely a lot more than I usually got for conferences. I don't know if you had the same experience.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was kind of a shitstorm before the shitstorm. I have been on Christy Winter's podcast. She was one of the first people that had me on. So like, she's on Facebook, Twitter. I know who Dan Arrow is. So I saw all of it. And I did have a brochure early on that had David Rubin on there. And what had happened was they were going to have Thomas Smith interview, debate / moderate a discussion with David Rubin, and then he pulled out, and that's when they substituted Sargon of Akkad, Carl Benjamin. And then I saw all of that happening, and I will say, I think they went too far. I mean, to call the facility and say you shouldn't even have this conference, that, or there's going to be a lot of violence or something like that. I felt uncomfortable with that. I think, you know, if somebody does it, there are a million conferences in the United States I wouldn't go to, right? And so if I don't like what somebody's doing, I'm not interested in, I don't go, you know, because if I spent my time trying to shut down conferences about things I disagreed with, that's all I'd be doing. I understand their perspective. I understand why they did it. And I certainly understand why people decided to pull out once that substitution was made. And let's be fair, once they were aware that substitution had been made, because like most people, oh, I didn't know you substitute somebody. And Christy Winters has had a lot of back and forth with Sargon of Akkad. So she has, you know, she has kind of a history there. But I decided to go anyway. And let's see what happens.
Yeah, Christy and Steve, and I guess Dan Arrow as well, were definitely big on the top, like, hey, here's what he's done. Did you know of Sargon / Carl before, and did you take a chance to look at videos, or you just kind of see what people were talking about? I mean, Christy did a couple of videos, I know, kind of distilling his points.
I saw a video that Christy did with him. I've seen a couple of other his videos. I've heard him talk about, yeah. So I was not familiar with Shoe on Head or Armored Skeptic. I'd never heard of them before.
Yeah, I'd heard of Armored Skeptic and maybe I mean, it's kind of those early days where you just kind of bounce around and check out a bunch of people's stuff, but it never stuck, and I still have no idea who Shoe on Head is, but I know they're really in a relationship and they talk together, but I guess we'll get to that. So since you had tickets and this was an area you were familiar with, you never thought like, hey, maybe I shouldn't come to this. You were like, you were going to be in no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, I had airline tickets, I had a hotel reservation, and, you know, it kind of was like, well, this is going to be interesting. It's not going to be boring. So, yeah, I didn't have any intention of pulling out.
Well, when did you get there, like the night before? I don't know if events were happening the night before, because I know it was kind of a one-day thing.
There may have been something that somebody talked about 2 parties. I didn't get in until 9 o'clock, so I just went the next day, but I did go to the one on Saturday evening. So I pretty much just started out with a huge line around Pabst Theater, total security. Everyone was wanded before they got in, all of that kind of stuff. It was like at the airport.
Yeah, I was wondering what it was like in line waiting, because, I mean, I've been to ReasonCon, and ReasonCon, 300 people, 400 people, but they're all in a hotel, and most people are staying there, so there's no waiting in line. But so what was it like in line? Had you already like met up with some people that you knew, or did you just people watch? Because it must have been great for that.
Yeah, and of course I am the marketer of my book, so I did the whole line and passed out my cards that have the book on it, my blog, etc. Like, oh, hi, here's a new book about women atheists. I passed out 1,500 at the Reason rally. I probably only passed 100 out or 200 here. So I was going up and down the line, and then I got back in line and waited and went in and, you know, talked to my friend and somebody else who she'd met.
Nice. I didn't even think of that as a marketing opportunity, but yeah, that's a good one. I mean, any of these conferences, I mean, I got cards for this show, and the only time I hand them out are at conferences. So yeah, it's like, there you go.
Well,
Get
and
to
I
know
think,
me.
it's like any other kind of conference you go to. Some of the connections you make outside the ballroom are some of the most important. I'd been trying to get somebody to blurb my book, and I didn't get a response. And I was talking to Matt Dillahunty and David Fitzgerald, and Matt said, yeah, she's not very good about returning emails. David, bless his heart, took out his phone, texted her, and got a response back, said, yes, she'd be happy to do it. So, wow, that was extremely helpful to me. I had met some people that I'd been on their podcast I hadn't met personally. And somebody, when I did the Free Thought Festival in Madison, Wisconsin, wanted me to sign a book. Well, you can't sell books at that, so I hadn't brought any. And I said, but I'm going to be in Mythicist, Milwaukee. And darn if she didn't find me, and I signed her book. So there's all those other things happening that are sometimes even more helpful than what's happening in the conference per se.
I mean, did you get to bring any books, or you just like that wasn't going to happen?
Well, no, I brought a couple and I ended up giving them away. So, oh well, I was never in this for the money anyway.
That was a lot that'd be a lot to carry, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
So what was it like who, since all I know about is mainly the main event, the Thomas and Sargon event, who led off the conference? Like who was the first speaker?
Okay, the first was Armored Skeptic and Shoe on Head, and I really, I hadn't heard of them before, and it's hard when I'm sure you appreciate this when you're producing content to also listen to content. I try to listen to podcasts and stuff, but I can't. I spend so much time writing and reaching out to people, it's hard. So I wasn't familiar with them. I did talk to June, who's the Shoe on Head, a little bit at the break. And I would really have liked to talk to her later. And I did watch a couple of videos when I came home. It was a little sad to me that this young woman is coming across as an anti-feminist, and no doubt there are problems in the feminist community. But, so much has gone on before us. And if we don't understand that and why we're here the way we are today is because what people did before us. Anyway, but I would kind of like to engage her later on, I think. Anyway, they started out by saying that she'd never done a presentation before, a public presentation. And here she is in front of 500 people, and I guess she's an introvert, somebody said, so that had to be tough. So, kind of listen to that. And then they had, I should get the order right here so I can look at my brochure. The next thing they had was Melissa Chen, and she talked about what happened to the Enlightenment. We made a lot of progress in the Enlightenment that really got us on an evidence, science-based, etc., and what happened to it. And she did a really excellent presentation of explaining and going through that. And if there's any part of that video that they're going to put up that I would highly encourage people to listen to, it was Melissa Chen's. It was well-researched. She was very articulate. She's very smart. That was worthwhile. And I want to go back and watch that again and maybe even do a blog post on it. And then they had Sargon and Thomas Smith, which we'll come back to. They had Ron Miscavige, whose son took over Scientology, and that was kind of interesting. And then they had an excellent debate between Faisal Al-Mukhtar and Azra Nomani. Again, two very intelligent people. Azra's position is that she thinks Islam can be reformed. She was very articulate. And Faisal talking about, no, it can't, and here's why. And then there was dinner, and then the Batman and Jesus film and the party. So if you want to talk about Sargon, we can talk about that.
Sure, we can. I guess, I don't know. I didn't know, Armored Skeptic or Shoe on Head that much either, but I was wondering about Melissa Chen because I heard, in the Richard Carrier, and I'm going to try to link as many of these reviews from people who are there, from people who aren't there. But Richard Carrier had a pretty good, more nuanced than we're used to kind of discussion about the whole thing and kind of conferences in general. And he seemed to give good marks to Melissa Chen, although I did hear she talked kind of about postmodernism, which seems to be a bit of a boogeyman of late. Like people are attacking it without maybe.
Oh, she put it down totally.
Necessarily getting into it, like, oh, postmodernism is the cause of our issues. like everything that's wrong with us right now.
Well, I was in graduate school. I did a master's in literature. And when we studied the book written by Zola called Germinal, which was about these coal miners who lost their jobs and were starving, and somebody gave a report on the number of times the color blue was mentioned in the book, therefore it was about women, I decided not to pursue literature. So, I mean, there was a lot of stuff happening then in the 70s. It was totally ridiculous. And I just said, hey, you know, I don't have, what? I don't have time for any of that stuff. So I went on and did a PhD in something else. But she totally panned it. She didn't spend a lot of time talking about it. But I think, you know, she did a good job of outlining, you know, why are we where we are today? And I will tell you on the issue of feminism, you know, I was active in the 60s and 70s. I was on campuses, up with politics, doing all that sort of stuff. And then, you know, I got jobs, I got married, it really didn't pay much attention to it. And I had never really studied it all, third wave feminism. And 3 years ago, when I started to write my book, I had never heard of social justice warrior. I had never heard of the concept of the intersectionality. So all of that stuff was kind of new to me. I just wonder, you know, how dominant it really is. I know that on campuses and people who were on YouTube and social media think it's a really big deal, but is it a really big deal? You know, are there a million social justice warriors out there? Is that true?
Well, I hear that term a lot, and it comes off as a negative. I had a former guest kind of give me crap for being that, but I always thought, I mean, I get the concept of people going too far, but I always think it's an individual thing. It's a small group.
Yeah.
And you can point those out. That's totally cool. Like now we're super fractured. That's kind of interesting and kind of frustrating at the same time. But to say it's a negative because you intrinsically like care about people who are different from you, I don't really get that in a way. Yeah.
There's two things. One is somebody who argues for social justice, and we can talk about that in the context of Sargon's remark. I think that SJW is seen, I've seen it defined as a derogatory term for somebody who goes too far with social justice. So again, I am not an expert in that area.
We're all learning, but I always think of the people who are anti-social justice warriors or like status quo warriors. They've been like, hey, if we're going to come with a term for this, let's go for the term for people on the other side. Well, we might as well. This is it. You know, people have been talking about it a lot. I don't want this to be the total focus of the show, but clearly you were there. You know, you got to see it all. We'll probably get the video / audio soon. They had rules saying that you couldn't record, so people like Sharon Frankel, like friends of mine, were like posting minute-long little snippets, so we got to see little bits of it. So leading into it, you go ahead.
I think the primary issues, and this is a structural issue, is if you have two people who have diametrically opposed views, it's always nice to have a moderator, you know, and Matt Dillahunty did a great job of moderating between Faisal and Azra. Now, they were both totally polite, totally cool, totally respectful and all of that. But you should have known if you had Sargon on there, you probably weren't going to get that. And so they were like this. And it's pretty hard to stop and try to listen to what people are actually saying when they're going against each other. And there were a lot of people in the audience who the first thing that came up was the quote that Sargon had said to the British member of parliament, I wouldn't even rape you. And his audience segment applauded. And so that kind of set it up. It's like, and then I think Thomas got upset about the audience and their reaction. At one point in time, he called them deplorables. So in no way was this a reasonable discussion. But I took a lot of notes on what Sargon said, and I was trying to unpack it. And I did talk to him privately. I can certainly see that in any movement, whether it's feminism or atheism, et cetera, there are going to be people on the margins. You never have an homogenous group. Totally get it. And you're going to have to deal with that in any organization, in any job I've had. People, you know, I represented 14,000 attorneys. I can tell you they had really different views. And it takes a lot of work to bring people together and, you know, do a strategic plan for the organization and et cetera. And when you're in this social media, you tend to be the extreme because that's what's getting your followers. So you had two people, maybe at the extreme, maybe not, in an unorganized debate. And my husband drove me to PSU today because there's something wrong with my back. And one of the things he said, we were talking about politics and we were talking about all the people who still support Trump. And you kind of go, God, how can you be reasonable and educated and support him? And they said they want to have their voice heard. And what he is saying pleases his supporters. And it's not going to matter whether tax reform happens or not, or whether they get totally screwed with the tax reform. They feel somebody's talking about me, somebody's saying something. And I think the followers of Sargon are feeling disenfranchised, whether it's because of feminism or social justice or whatever. And they're going, at least somebody's talking to us, at least somebody's listening to it. But the saddest thing for me was being in that audience, listening to what he had to say, and we'll talk about that, and seeing all of these people clapping. And I thought, God, have we really come to that? Is it so polarized? And so again, trying to unpack what he said, and forget the fact that he talked about somebody who was killed and laughed about it and all of those things. Those are off the charts, inappropriate. But one of the things he said, and to Thomas, is you focus on the group versus the individual. You can't do that. And I didn't have the opportunity to say to him, how have we ever achieved things through our history, if not by doing it as a group? Let's take women's rights to vote. Did a woman just walk into the booth one day and said, my turn, I get a vote? Of course she didn't. She aligned with other women suffragettes. She aligned with men who supported her position. And it took 4 decades of that kind of group activity to get the right to vote. The same thing is true with the Civil Rights Act. It wasn't Martin Luther King going to Congress and say, I want you to write this act. Oh, it never happened. I mean, we had decades of Jim Crow before we got to the point where people were willing to fight that, and they fought hard to get it, and people died for that. And we got the Civil Rights Act passed. And then frankly, we got sex in there because somebody thought that if they added sex, the whole bill would die. So that focus on the individual sounded a lot like Ayn Rand to me, which is this kind of anti-Marxist, anti-socialist, anti-collectivism, that it's only the individual that counts. And he did actually say that. He said, if you don't have unequal outcomes, you don't have freedom. If you look at equal outcomes instead of looking at equal opportunity, you don't have freedom. And he kept on calling the feminist and intersectionality Marxist collectivism. And whew, you know, I'd never heard that before. I've read Karl Marx, didn't make any sense to me. And I just think it belies how change occurs. Changes occurs because people get together, they talk about issues, they unite, and they work hard at it. Now, you give me your reaction to that.
Yeah, the libertarianism does speak of a bit of a, I mean, that's the group that he's definitely looking toward, is kind of a young white male that thinks they kind of deserve privilege, or they think that they're actually being discriminated against in the current culture.
I think that's
there are so many places you can go and easily find, oh, the crazy screaming, you know, feminist on campus or something. And yet to say, I mean, I feel like saying Marxist is like that. People saying negative stuff about the anti-fascist, oh, they're communist and communists are bad because we've been taught that in our whole lives in America without actually getting into what it actually means. And it seemed like every time, at least, of course, this is from Thomas's point of view in today's Serious Inquiries Only, every time he tried to actually talk facts with Karl, he didn't get anything back. It was just that, it was almost like, hey, on the other side, you can't be emotional and you can't react, but on my side, it's totally okay. They want the ability to kind of yell whatever they want and be heard, but they don't necessarily want to listen on the other side. And
yeah.
Clearly we have to listen.
Yeah. A lot of times Sargon said, well, I don't care. Well, if you're in a debate with somebody, again, if there had been a moderator, the moderator would say, would you please address the point he raised? And this was like, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care what you think. And again, it wasn't structured. I think the debate between him and Christy Winters, they had laid out a lot of guidelines. They did it like a debate. They had to cite their sources and all that kind of stuff. So it was, frankly, it was much easier to listen to. This was difficult. But, you know, teasing that out and saying that anything you do collectively is bad. And he claims that he's a classical liberal. And I find that saying it's only about individuals, it kind of, you know, reminded me of Horatio Alger. He's this 19th century author who said, you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That's all you need to do. And it's called The Myth of Horatio Alger. That
it is a myth.
It is a myth. And he went so far as to say, somebody asked him a question about, well, what if you're in a ghetto? What if you're in a community that's really disadvantaged? He said, well, that's your community. You've stuck there because that's what you want to do. And if you want to get out of it, it's up to you. And my response would be, look, I was born into a middle-class family that had a house, that had food on the table, that my mother was highly educated, encouraged us to go to school, paid for my college. You can't compare that to somebody who's, you know, one of 10 kids living in poverty and whose parents are drug addicts or something, and barely can get to school. And trust me, that happens. And then you say, oh, well, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You can certainly do that, but that doesn't compare to the life I had. I mean, when I arrived at that college door, I was in a totally different place than the other person. So how do you deal with that? Well, you try to limit poverty, you know, you do things like that. And to me, that's social justice. You try to look at the tax code and say, is it only helping the rich? You know, and you look at those type of things. And sometimes when I say something like that, I go, God, am I showing my age? Am I missing something here? But I was very surprised to look behind some of the things he said.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, this might be a softball question to ask you, but when Sargon called feminism a mental illness, like, how do you absorb that kind of shallow argument? And doesn't even have, I mean, this has got to be something you've probably heard before, but to hear it with so much support.
Well, yeah, and to hear, you know, to think of what I've gone through in my life, and to hear these young men clap to feminism as a mental disease was really depressing. I mean, when I was in college, I applied for a scholarship to Dartmouth. And when I interviewed, they said, why should we give it to you? You'll just get married and have kids and get out of school. No male was asked that question. You know, I'm sorry. Guess what? I didn't get the scholarship. Was it because I wasn't smart enough? No, I kind of had a 3.9 GPA, probably not. And no man would have been asked that. To me, that's discrimination. I think we've come a long way. But I will tell another example. I had a job as executive director of the state bar, and they're probably not happy I always use this example, but we had a subsidiary organization. And I knew from experience that they hired a guy, and I knew they were going to pay him more than me. And so I went to my board and I said, here's my salary. I have 90 employees. That person has 40s. Here's my deputy, da-da-da. Here's where that person should align. What did they do? They hired him at $35,000 more than I was making. So I went to my board. I'm not a victim. I'm not going to whine. I went to my board and said, I'll sue you. That's ridiculous. And they said, well, we'll hire a human resources consultant. And the human resources consultant studied both the positions that said, geez, she has a lot more responsibility. The only thing I can come up with discrimination on the basis of sex. And guess what? I got a $35,000 raise. So is there still discrimination? Yeah, there is. And you have to fight harder for your rights. You know, he didn't fight to get that extra $35,000. I had to fight to get the equality. So if you go on the street and ask 99 out of 100 women what feminism means, they're going to say it's gender equality. All we want to do is have it equal. We want to be paid the same as a guy who's doing the same job. We don't want to be discriminated on the basis of sex. If I'm an author and send in a book with a man's name, I don't want to get accepted when I send it in with a woman's name and not get it accepted. And you've heard the stuff in Hollywood, et cetera. Are we better off in a lot of places? Absolutely. But we're still 65th as a country in pay equity. And guess who's first? Iceland. Why is Iceland first? Because they don't have religion. They're, you know, the Christian monks came to Iceland in the year 1000 and they said, yeah, we got to deal with you because of commerce, but we're going to keep our myths. And, you know, and they let go of religion very quickly. Religion is very entrenched in our society. It's going to be a long time to get rid of it. And I do believe religion is the last cultural barrier to gender equality. I don't think we're going to have true equality when we have politicians up there who are talking about God and women's rights. So
true. Well, what do you have to say? Because I get the argument like, well, feminism, but egalitarianism instead. Does that compute at all?
I think we're at a point where we need to look at specific things that happen. You know, there is a higher male suicide rate than for females, as what I've heard. I haven't researched this, so don't quote me on that. But if there is, then let's take a look at that. What are we doing? How are we teaching? You know, what is it that causes that? We have a higher incarceration rate of males. Why is that? You know, what are we teaching males? How are we bringing up males that end up more in prison than females? Is there equality before the law? I don't have any problem looking at all of those types of things. And I think in the United States, we have made a lot of progress. When my mother wanted to go to college, she told her father, I want to study art. And he said, no, you're going to be a teacher. That was it. And it wasn't until she retired that she actually got to pursue what she wanted to. I think the influence in my generation was, if you don't see any models of an anthropologist or a physics teacher or an astronaut who's a female, you automatically don't think you can be that. And both my sister and I were kind of brought up in a culture that you're a teacher, a secretary, or a nurse, and I had no intention of being a secretary or a nurse, so I started out as a teacher. I didn't end up that way, but that's, you know, Mom was a teacher, Kathy was a teacher, that's what I'll do. Today, there's a lot more models out there. And you've got that little boy looking up at Obama saying, wow, you got black skin, I got black skin, you're president, hot shit. And one of the reasons I wrote my first book, Women Beyond Belief, was to give women examples of people who've left religion. And unfortunately, most of the books written by atheists are written by men, and they deal with atheism ideologically or those kind of issues. And this is about the experience of women. And if we want to get women out of the churches, which is what I want to do, then we need to address some of those concerns.
Yeah, do you know, as someone who was around, you know, protesting was a big thing in the 60s and 70s, and it kind of tailed off. Do you think we're having kind of the same battles? Like, do you think we always have to keep having the same kind of fights? You know, civil rights was a big thing. Women's equality was a big thing. And now it seems like some people are trying to kind of dial things back. Like the House is trying to pass abortion restrictions. You know, there are certain states that only have one abortion clinic. Yeah. And there's this fight to bring things back to the good old days for like a few select white men. But is it frustrating to see that it seems like we're having the same kind of arguments, or is it kind of, I don't know, make you feel better that people are still willing to have these fights?
Well, I think it's incredibly discouraging. The only reason, or the pivotal reason I got involved in the atheism movement was the Hobby Lobby decision. And I think we talked about this the last time I was on your show, where because of Citizens United, a corporation was a person, so Hobby Lobby was a person, so they could have religious views and decide not to provide reproductive care under Obamacare to their female employees. And I said, bullshit, we fought this battle. What are we doing this for? And there have been a lot more restrictions on abortion in the last few years, and like states that have one clinic. And to me, that most of the arguments used to be against abortion are religious arguments. And it's almost like the same old power and control. I saw today that there was a Republican representative in Congress who had been anti-abortion, and then it was revealed that he talked his girlfriend into trying to get an abortion. what a hypocrite, right? He gets in the situation and, oh, why don't you go get an abortion? And yet he's railing against abortion. And I think, you could have a change in the Supreme Court and take away Roe v. Wade. I think there'd be a revolution if it happened, but it's very frustrating to see those equal rights that you've gained being eroded. And yeah, it'll take another fight. I mean, could Handmaid's Tale happen? But I suppose it could, and we'll be there to fight it. It's like the Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill. Just as you get the rock up your hill, you're going, we got equal rights, that's great. The rock falls down and you're fighting all over for abortion. So that's just the way people are. And I do think, I don't think there would ever be a fight in France or Iceland for abortion. I mean, it's a right. They have it. They also have single payer health care. They're not going to have that discussion. Why? Because they're hardly religious at all. There isn't an argument. The only argument being made against abortion really is religion, which is all a myth. So there we go.
Yeah, and the same people who are pro-life cannot battle enough against any kind of gun restriction, even after we just had a crazy attack this week in Las Vegas where one person, how many people did he shoot? 600?
59.
I mean,
oh yeah.
And the only thing that's being discussed in the NRA is like, well, maybe the thing that makes a semi-automatic into an automatic, maybe we should get rid of that. That's as far as we're willing to go right now.
And the same pro-life people, they're not adopting children if they're born. Are they out there saying we'll adopt every child that's in an orphanage? Oh, come on. Of course they're not. Are they against food stamps? Are they against welfare? Yeah, they're against welfare, and yet welfare is designed for the children. It's those children who are born that we want to help out and be sure they have an equal stance, whether it's, Head Start or something like that, but they're anti those things as well. It's totally hypocritical in my opinion anyway.
Very true. So, okay, so back to the Thomas, Carl, everybody wants to talk about that. You asked the first question. Now, of course, we got to get into what you actually asked and the reaction and all that, but did you have to body up some people to get in front of the line there? Because I'm assuming it was an 80-minute talk. I think it was 50 minutes till questions started. It was a pretty long time. Oh,
I was in the fifth row, and I just crawled, leaned down and went to the front, and somebody was there, and I got in front of him. I said, I'm going to be first. But nice. I was really close to the front. Anyway, so he said okay when I went first. I didn't push him out of the way.
What did you ask?
Well, it wasn't really a question. I was one of those people who didn't really ask a question. But I said, introduced myself as a faithless feminist. I said religion is the last culture, I believe, is the last cultural barrier to gender equality. And I want to get women out of the churches. And we're not going to do it with two white men talking about feminism and intersectionality. And of course, Sargon immediately said, well, I'll try not to be male next time. And, the point was, I could have been more articulate, is, if you want to talk about these issues and you particularly want to talk about women's rights, it just seems to me it'd be nice to have a woman up there. And I told the organizers that. I said, I could have found you somebody in a heartbeat. You know me. But it was kind of happenstance because Thomas had been picked to debate or talk to Reuben. Reuben pulled out. They substituted Sargon. Thomas stayed. I'm not sure he's really happy he did that. But for example, the movie was a great movie. It's interesting. I contributed to it. They were talking about Batman as a myth versus Jesus as a myth. And I believe, I may be wrong, but every single atheist they had talk on the Jesus side was a man. And on the Batman side, everyone was a man except one woman. Do we not stop and think, let's get a variety of opinions? And I'm not talking about, oh, the only people who can talk about this are women. Oh, the only people who can talk about this are transgender people. Because then you're doing the exact thing on the opposite end of the spectrum. But if you want to have a debate, have people with difference of opinion, but look at who is best to talk in those situations. Now, Brian, one of the organizers, and I had a little debate outside afterwards, and I said, well, look, if you were talking about the experience of giving birth to a child, would you have a panel of all men? And he said, well, what if they were male gynecologists? I said, if you're talking about gynecology, okay, I still wouldn't do that. But if you want to talk about what does it feel like and how much the hell does it hurt, you should probably talk to the person who's actually giving birth. Mix the panel up, fine. But to have no one who's actually experienced it makes no sense to me. And I thought we were beyond that. I thought we looked at the topics and had a variety of people to get different viewpoints. Because what we're doing is stultifying debate. We're stultifying intellectual discussion when we do that. And we only want the extremes of both sides in there. And it was disappointing because of that, I think. I would have interested, having a really good debate about his position and digging in and finding out about this whole individual thing and saying, how can you say you're a classic liberal when you're really, this kind of individual libertarian, make it on your own, don't help anybody, get out of the ghetto yourself. That would have been an interesting political discussion. Alas.
What do you think? Because, you talked about it in particular just to that debate. Was it, I guess the diversity wasn't up to your standards in terms of the speakers overall for the conference?
No, I think overall, I just read Richard Carrier's take, and it's on his blog. Just Google it, or you're going to put a link there.
I will be linking
thought
to
it was,
definitely.
He's a smart guy. He's a smart guy, and I have read his 800-page book. I thought he did a very tactful, fair representation of the conference and what it takes to organize a conference. And there was diversity in the conference. Melissa Chen, Azra, they had Shoe on Head. They had women. They had they addressed the Islam issue, and so they had a variety of topics. But when with all the controversy that happened, it kind of like centered on this one debate. So that's why, anything that's controversial is going to get the most attention.
Well, I mean, when the Thomas and Sargon debate ended, did a large percentage of the audience just leave? I mean, definitely the Sargon people seemed to take off at that point.
There were a lot of people who left, and I don't know who they were. I would guess they were a lot of the people who were clapping for Sargon. There were, I stepped out in the hall and I wanted to pose a question to him. And he says, well, I'm not debating. So he was standing around with his fans, and the people who really supported him. And he has a right to do that. He was done with it, but a lot of them did leave.
And in a way, you're talking about diversity in atheist conferences, and that's definitely an issue. But it's interesting that conference had this like Islam debate, and Islam doesn't get as much attention because we are definitely Christianity focused in this country. Yeah. How was that debate? I mean, the fact that there was a moderator and it seemed like the speakers were more civil to each other. They weren't trying to like score points. They're actually trying to, make a debate. How was that?
It was very informative. I thought in particular, she let out and she talked for 10 minutes without looking at a note. And that was pretty impressive. But Faisal is well known and articulate. And I think they made each of those positions. She had voted for Trump and was trying to kind of rationalize that. But it was very informative. But, people do respond to the margins. It's like, why does Sargon have 700,000 followers? Because people want to hear that, and he's knocking other people. And let me give you another example. So I watched one of Shoe on Heads because I'd never heard of her videos. And what she had done is take clips from women who said something like, I don't want to be called sweetie. And she mocked it. Oh, I don't want to be called sweetie. Oh, that's so bad. It's kind of the Richard Dawkins people in the Middle East are getting, genital mutilation. You're worried about calling sweetie. Hey, come on. I call people sweetie. I'm old. I get away with it. Is that really relevant? Is that really important? And she had all these things that were, again, kind of like on the margins. Do people really complain about being called cute anymore? At my age, hey, call me a cutie. I love it. I just think there are more substantive issues that could be discussed, but it's entertainment. And here's another point. You don't have to justify anything you say on YouTube. You can have a YouTube channel, never talk to anyone who's opposed to what you say, ever. That was the first time they were in, and I wouldn't call it a debate because it was both of them together, but that was the first time they'd ever made a public presentation. So you can carve out your niche, do what you want, and she spent a lot of time on it. Both of them have, and a lot of work, and I acknowledge that. But I was sitting there thinking, wow, are you just going to be anti-feminist and anti-everything that's been accomplished? Are you going to kind of piss on the grave of Elizabeth Cady Stanton? Let's acknowledge what it took to get where we are today, and to acknowledge that you wouldn't have even been allowed to do that 100 years ago. So, you know, yeah, maybe there's a fringe movement here, and maybe it should be criticized, but there's also other things in feminism that you need to acknowledge. So that kind of balance wasn't there.
Yeah, and well, we talked about, you know, we're talking about the people who talk to the conference, but when you go to a conference, that's not even, I don't think 50% of the reason to be there, because you're there to be with kind of your people. So what was it like kind of between sessions and then maybe the VIP party and getting to interact with some people that maybe you've only talked with online? And
well,
it doesn't have to be about your show or about, you know, what you're trying to do. It's like just hanging out.
I think there's two things to be said for that. I assumed that this was going to be a conference about atheism. And I think there were segments that didn't have anything to do with that. And I watched Callie Wright, the Gaytheist Manifesto podcast, where she interviewed the organizers. And they acknowledged and said, you know, that God is dead stuff, it doesn't really sell anymore. We got to have something else. And I thought, whoa, okay. And they said that Sargon was an entertainer. Bill Maher uses the N-word. So him saying that comment about rape was no different. It's like a comedian and an entertainer. And I don't think Sargon would want to be characterized as an entertainer. I think he's a social, political commentator. And I'm guessing, I don't know, that he would have probably been offended by saying, oh, he's just a comedian, he can say anything he wants. But if Mythicist Milwaukee decides to turn away from the focus like the Bart Ehrman and Robert Price and the discussion about those issues and turn to, you know, anti-feminist SJW debates and stuff, they have a perfect right to do that. And I will assure you that I will look more carefully at who's going to be on a conference when I decide to go, or if I'm invited to speak or something like that. But of course, I would be happy to speak at a conference where everyone disagreed with me, because, wow, that's, if you want to convert somebody, you want an audience that you're trying to convince. But clearly the hall conversations, I mentioned a couple of those, the people you meet. I met somebody introduced me to this book called, I want to say The Righteous Mind by Haidt, Jonathan Haidt, that I'm going to get a copy of. Is, what do we look at as truth? You know, we always talk about objective truth, but what is that? And looking at that from kind of an intellectual viewpoint. And I think it will help me digest some of the reactions I had to the conference. So was that worth my airline ticket and everything else? I don't know. But it was very, you know, it's very worthwhile. And I know Brian and Sean, so I gave them a bad time. You know, I'm okay. Yeah. I filled out my survey. I said what I wanted to say. I'm okay.
I would say you probably don't say, oh, let me just hold on to my opinion and not share it, especially when you made the effort to be there. Was it a little bit curious, though, because, you know, the name of the group is Mythicists, so they're always asking, like every guest they have, even if it isn't like a scholar, they ask about whether they think Jesus is real. And they had this movie. This was a thing they had worked on for years, and then they decided to like make it a secondary thing to this Sargon debate, which has nothing to do with that topic whatsoever. I mean, once the movie came up, was it kind of anticlimactic for the people attending?
Well, it was a nice break to have a movie versus
probably.
Trust me.
It was a little bit lighter.
And I don't think, you know, Sargon of Akkad may be an atheist, but that's not what he's known for. And I don't know about Shoe on Head and Armored Skeptic, but I'm not sure they're really known. They may be atheists, but that's not what they're talking about. So I think clearly in the interview with Callie, they said, you know, just this atheism debate is kind of dying off and we need to move on to something else. But there's so many things about myth that you can talk about that could have even been done in that context. Talking about, you know, the presentation I do on elimination of the feminine divine and the tracing into monotheism, and I would have been very happy to do that. I mean, it really makes you stop and think about what are the memes associated with when those memes change? What's the impact of looking at a male deity? And part of it is it really changes the way you view the world. When there was a female goddess, it was all about cycles, the cycle of the earth. You want to say Mother Earth, right? The death and life being the same thing. And when you would go to a male god, it switches eventually to this kind of linear thing of time and the gods in the sky. They're not part of creation. All of those things influence, number one, the way we look at climate change. You know, our whole attitude toward the earth is, you know, we're going to be in heaven and God gave us dominion so we can do anything we want to do. And culture has, you know, it has its grip on it, but we don't look at it carefully enough. So there's a lot of things I think that Mythicist Milwaukee could explore. But if you want controversy and if you want people polarized and if you want to talk about those issues, they did a good job of that. I mean, if you really want to have an anti-feminist at your conference to talk about poor men, women are now advantaged and privileged over men. If you want to do that, they were successful in doing that.
Yeah, it was almost like a go for the short buck kind of deal. And they did, and we'll see what happens. Well, what do you think, I mean, now that you've been to this conference, about conferences that you might want to attend in the future, like conferences where you might have an opportunity to speak, where they might have a more diverse crowd and kind of try to go after more interesting conversation than just people yelling at each other?
Well, my focus is I want women to rave religion because it subjugates them in so many different ways. And it's a myth. It's not true. And I want to convince women to give up religion, to be skeptics, and to feel more empowered in their lives. And if somebody wants me to talk about that at a conference, I'm happy to come. And if everyone disagrees with me at the conference, great. I'll go to a men's rights activist conference to talk about it. But in ones I go,
that.
Huh?
I would like to record that. That'd be good.
Okay.
There wouldn't be a lot of listening, but I think you're talking.
I'm happy to do that. But if I'm going to go to a conference, I'm going to look more carefully at the agenda and what it's about and what can I learn from it. I'm not going for entertainment. You know, I don't watch comedy on TV. I'm more of a academic, I guess, and I'm really interested in learning more about things and sharing them with people versus mocking people. It's not my cup of tea.
Okay, well, since I had you on, now you were on episode 66, so it was a while back. Since then, I've had Wendy Marsman on. Now, can you talk about your side of the story for Women Beyond Belief? Because clearly we can't trust Canadians. So how did you kind of get to know each other and start this partnership?
Well, okay. Now, I will say that almost everyone I've met in the atheist community has been incredibly welcoming. Peter Boghossian has been my mentor. I apply him with sushi lunches and he makes connections. Everywhere I've been, there are some exceptions. There are people who want to have their own niche and they don't want to share it. I totally get that. That's fine. And I'm not going to take names here. But Wendy called me, connected, don't ask me what medium she called me on, Facebook, whatever. She was a missionary in Brazil for 30 years, and she talked about that on your podcast. And she wanted to start a podcast for women non-believers. And somebody suggested she call it Women Beyond Belief. Well, she Googled Women Beyond Belief, saw my book, and she emailed me and she said, if you don't want me to use this title for my podcast, I won't do it. And I said, are you kidding? I said, let's work together. I said, I'll get some of my authors on your podcast, and I will advertise your podcast on my website. And we've worked together. I've been recording some of my blogs, and she puts them on when she doesn't have a guest. So we've worked great together. And I think I'm not interested in doing a podcast. It's a lot of work, but we work really closely together. So, the more people out there that you can get involved. I had somebody else, Teresa Roberts, saw my name on a Facebook page of John Loftus and said, "Oh, woman atheist." So she friended me, and she's going to write for my blog. So, all of this happenstance that comes together. And I do have, if anybody is interested, I have a list, an Excel spreadsheet of virtually every atheist podcast. And I'm happy to share it with everyone. It was a ton of work to put together. And if anyone's written a book and wants to be on podcast, I'll send it to them, because you shouldn't have to go through that again.
Yeah, you should get in touch with Karen, because she's reached out for about a few authors that I should have on my show. And sometimes it's hard to do because you think you're in competition, but really I'm thinking with a niche subject like atheism, we need to work together, because there are more of us than you think, but there aren't that, many. Now you had your first book came out, but apparently there's another one. There's more happening. There's a sequel. There's an Electric Boogaloo. What's the next book, and what's the timing of it coming out?
The next book is called Women versus Religion, and it's got this kind of woman justice thing on the front of the book, and the subtitle is A Case Against Faith and for Freedom. And that's going to be coming out in the spring. It's actually on Amazon now, but it's not available for pre-order. I just finished the manuscript. But for this book, I asked a lot of women who had already written a book about atheism. Valerie Tirico, who wrote Trusting Doubt, Sakivo Hutchinson. Well, she's actually blurbing it. She gave me the names of a couple of women who were African American, because she couldn't do it, but she's going to blurb it. Abby Hafer wrote the book, The Not So Intelligent Designer, and she has the funniest essay in this book. It is really hilarious. I got an ex-Muslim. It wasn't easy to get a woman willing to write. She is using a pseudonym. She wrote about her perspective. I have 2 Hispanic atheist women writing. So it's more of an academic book. It's not personal stories per se. They may bring personal issues into it, but it's a book. If you can read through this book and still say, I believe in God, then I give up. I am going to try to pitch the book to Women's Studies program, because, as I said, I don't know how you can study women roles, gender roles, without looking at religion. So I'm going to see how that plays out.
Well, you mentioned before, about the fact that female deities were kind of written out. Can you talk about that post? Because I don't know, I saw you mention this on Twitter today or yesterday. It may have been something you posted earlier, but it's definitely an idea you've had going for a while. But about what happened when goddesses were kind of replaced by gods.
And for your listeners, if you go to YouTube and go Faithless Feminist, you can watch one of the presentations I've done that have been recorded. But through my study of myth, etc., nobody disagrees that there were pantheons, because we learned them in high school, and the Romans were kind of lazy and said, those Greek gods look good, we'll just take them and change their names. And nobody disagrees that Judaism is one of the longest lasting monotheistic religions, and the Christianity came out of that. Okay, that's nobody disagrees about that. Well, in the 60s, when more women got into archaeology, they started to look at, these figurines that they found in the Paleolithic. What could that have meant? And they started to study, myths of the goddess that still exists in part of the world. And one of the hypotheses was that the first kind of supernatural, and it's hard to say religion, and it's really not belief, but if you're a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer and you depend on nature, why wouldn't you revere nature? You would go, golly, we have to have the spring come. This has to happen, and we're not going to survive. And the other thing is, you're a male. You go and you get hurt by some rock, and you bleed and you die, and you come back to the cave, and the woman's having this period every 30 days, and she never dies. That had to be, wow, how is that happening? And then she gets pregnant, and for 9 months, she doesn't bleed. So there was this early thought that was held on to very, very long, that the blood formed the child. I mean, literally into the Middle Ages, through the Dark Ages, that it was the blood that women stopped bleeding was that. And then you look at she bleeds 13 times a year. The lunar cycle is 13 times a year. I mean, it's totally natural that you would go, wow, you know, that's pretty cool. So you start to go, you know, Mother Earth, female, divine, etc. And we know from, you know, where we have writing in the pantheon how there were still goddesses. And there's many theories of how the male god got integrated into that. But I think it's pretty clear how the female god got eliminated, because we can even see that in the Bible. In the Bible, they're polytheistic. It's God of the assembly. You've got references to Asherah, which was a Canaanite goddess. So you can even see in the Bible, while they were struggling to getting a male deity. Plus, when they were exiled in Babylon, they had exposure to all the Babylonian myths. And there's a Babylonian myth called Enuma Elish that predates anything that happened in early Israelite, you know, by several hundred years, where Marduk is one of the gods. And he says to the male gods, if you make me the top god, I'll get rid of Tiamat, the female god, who happens to be a sea monster, just like Leviathan and Rahab in the Bible. And they're there and they're going, yeah, maybe that's why the Babylonians beat us, because they had this single male god. Okay, let's go. And I'm simplifying it, but clearly they were influenced by those myths. I mean, if you take a look at the Noah Ark story and put it next to Gilgamesh, it is, you know, almost like word for word. The bird flies away, the bird comes back, they build an ark. I mean, it's, and that's what cultures do. They borrow pieces. And they look at this and say, well, they're really successful and they have this, maybe we should try that. And that's the way it goes. And pretty soon the female goddess is eliminated. Eve's charged with carnal lust and original sin, and the rest is history.
Yeah, the rest is a lot of history. And what a breezy hour. Like, I couldn't even say, oh, let me take a break from my live reads. I just couldn't do it because Karen is too darn good and you have so much to say and you probably could talk for hours, but apparently you have some kind of taco event coming up. So yeah, tell people where they can kind of find you online. Everything will be in the show notes, but, you know, it helps when you just let them know.
Well, when I hired a marketing guy, he suggested the name of my blog, Godless Grandmother, and I said, let's not emphasize how old I am. So he said Faithless Feminist, and again, I'd never heard what happened to that word. But I am Faithless Feminist on YouTube. www.faithlessfeminist.com is my blog. I'm at Karen_Garst on Twitter. And that's kind of how you find me.
And really, if you have like a bad taste in your mouth because of what happened this weekend in Milwaukee, get that taste in your mouth by supporting atheists. So go look up Karen on Amazon and go buy her book. Help her out. Buy her a taco or something. You know, do something little. And I just wanted to quickly put in something that was going to be in my live reads. I just finished a storytelling class. And what really added weight to the story I told, because I told a story that's an easy story to tell, the fact that I survived a staph infection, almost died. When I started telling the story from my mom's point of view, the person who was there and took care of me for like 2 months while I was gone and literally had to tell doctors not to put me back in a coma, which probably would have killed me. I mean, that added so much weight to it and made it interesting. And it just basically says, hey, check out other people's points of view. You may get that point of view and go, okay, never mind, but at least give it a shot. No. And I think that's something that's missing in discourse. I know we're on the internet, so it's hard. And maybe some people you just need to brush off, but other people, you're going to find layers and you're going to be okay. But I do want to say, you know, for people who want to support this show, Bobby and Ashley do a great show, No Religion Required. They got, you know, the pastor on there, which is definitely interesting. Hugh-Man, big Atlanta United fan. Sorry they lost to Minnesota this week, but you're one of the playoffs. You're cool. Teodi, all about the smoothies. I need your recipes. Marissa, of course, working on like her 5th book. It's crazy how much she's just producing. And I'm just glad I've had an opportunity to have her on the show. So go to patreon.com/Zachrilege, Zachrilege. And I can spell it after 2 beers. So can you follow me on Twitter at Zachrilege, like the Zachrilege Cast page on Facebook. I will attempt to get a little more interaction going there and try to post basically the stuff I'm reading and listening to as often as I can. if you have guests who you think need to be on this show, because, hey, I need to talk to somebody else. I'm not that interesting. Zachrilege.cast@gmail. And, of course, thank you to Karen again for being on tonight.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Anytime. Just off the charts. Amazing. So for the listeners, stay safe. If you need to chat, I am available. If you're an atheist and feel alone, you are not alone. Please reach out. Let's chat and get that human connectedness, which is way better than what those people do every Sunday. So stay skeptical. I love all y'all, and good night and gong sound.